Good evening. Well, this is deservedly a pretty good event. We don't get people like Bill McKibben to come and talk with us that often. I'm Gary Snyder, and I'm here to introduce Bill McKibben. It won't take long. Bill is an American natural treasure. If he was in some old traditional country like Japan, they already would have pickled him to keep him preserved. And it is for me a great pleasure and an honor to be involved with bringing Bill to Nevada County, along with the Yuba Watershed Institute and the Ananda School of Wisdom and Sustainable Living. Good luck. Well, that's what we're all looking for, right? Bill and I first crossed paths in Manhattan probably 20 years ago, shortly after he had published his first major book, The End of Nature, and I had published my first major book of prose essays, The Practice of the Wild. And we were invited to have a discourse, a dialogue. Can we please have the lights back on the way they were? That's the way we wanted to have them set up from the beginning, so that we can see our audience and be part of it. Thank you. Yeah. Energy is a mysterious force. Thanks. Bill also wrote a piece about my work years ago for the New York Review of Books. Incidentally, the best periodical serial journal of scholarship, literature, and intellectual possibilities in the United States. I recommend it highly. Although, once you subscribe to it, you can't keep up with it. So that was the beginning of a long association between the two of us, not without some bumps, because in the early years of climate change, I kept invoking the 300 million year climate history that the planet has lived through, pointing out things like it's nothing new. However, the truth is, if I was a dinosaur, I would have to be more excited about what's happening. And since I'm a primate right now, we should all be excited about we should all be disturbed and engaged in what is happening. I'm not going to try to take over what Bill has to say, and I don't know for sure what he's going to say tonight, but this morning out at the Ananda School up on the hill back of my place, I thought he spoke most eloquently about how all of us, ordinary, or if you like, far out, or if you like, counterculture, or whatever we are, Americans, still have a long way to go in dealing with the issues that are confronting us henceforth. Bill McKibben has been tirelessly organizing and traveling for a number of years now. He launched 350.org, that organization, some years ago, and it is now found in, as he says, every country except North Korea. I volunteered to go to North Korea and see if I can start it there, but I don't know. Bill is very modest, and he is also an extremely prolific writer. His two most recent books, to mention them, is Deep Economy, which is to some degree a very useful play on the term that many of you remember, deep ecology, and Earth, his very latest book, which I have been reading and appreciating a great deal, is not only full of practical, down on the ground, gritty, useful information, but some very impressive and useful information about American history. And the earlier history of the United States and what it was that people thought they were getting ready to do on this continent. So it is a great pleasure for me to introduce to you now Bill McKibben of Vermont.
Well, look, Gary, thank you so much for that. I mean, one's a little lost for words after being introduced by one of one's very small list of real heroes. The people who meant the most intellectually to me, who kind of set my mind afire at a certain age, were very, very few in number, and at the top of the list were Wendell Berry, the great Kentucky farmer and essayist, and Gary Snyder, the great poet and thinker and man. And his example absolutely priceless to us all. So it is a great pleasure for me to be here. Probably a greater pleasure for me than it will be for you. I'm sometimes aware after a particularly beautiful day, and today was impossible to beat. I mean, we wandered around up there on the ridge looking at the cherry trees, and then we went down to John Teclin's farm and looked at the first vegetables, getting all you CSA members soon. I think they'll be ready for you to harvest, and it couldn't have been more wonderful. It's days like that that I'm aware that I've summoned you all here, and that my basic role in life is to be a professional bummer-outer of people, you know. And for that, I apologize, and I will do my best to get to a hopeful place at the end. I promise I will. But I fear we really best go through the valley for a moment first, because part of the thing about climate change is understanding not only that there's some problem called climate change, but getting a real visceral sense of its scale, so that we can figure out what kind of scale of solution we need in order to deal with it. I wrote the first book, as Gary said, about global warming way back in 1989, 23 years ago. I was young, I was 27, I guess, at the time, and we knew then really what we needed to know. We knew that when you burn coal and gas and oil, you put carbon in the atmosphere, and we knew its molecular structure trapped heat that would otherwise radiate back out to space. The only things we did not know then were how fast and how hard this was going to pinch, And the story of the last 20 years is that it's pinching way harder and way faster than we thought. The reason that we underestimated it was twofold. One, scientists by nature are conservative. They underestimate, not overestimate. The second is it was hard for us to get our minds around the idea that we could change things that much. All of human civilization, 10,000 years of it, rest in this period that scientists call the Holocene, a period of benign climatic stability. And that's one of the reasons we were able to build these civilizations. It was very difficult for us to imagine that we were going to somehow get out of that, break out of that, that we could knock that off kilter, and yet we have. So far, human beings have raised the temperature of the planet about a degree. We're trapping about 3/4 of a watt of extra solar energy per square meter of the Earth's surface. Those figures sound fairly small, but in fact, they are large enough extra energy to cause enormous, enormous change. So, for instance, I noticed that there are one or two other people in this room of the same vintage as I, and so old enough to remember when those first pictures came back from the Apollo missions of view of the Earth from outer space, this beautiful blue-white marble floating in that black void. Those pictures are as out of date as my high school yearbook picture is. You know, if you hold up a picture of the Earth in the summertime right now, there's 40% less ice in the Arctic than there was then. If you go out into the beautiful Pacific or any other ocean on Earth and stick a piece of pH paper in it, the ocean is 30% more acid than it was then, because seawater's chemistry changes as it absorbs carbon from the atmosphere. I mean, that's amazing. The oceans are our metaphor for vastness. It didn't occur to us that we could substantially alter them, but we have. Maybe the thing that as terrestrial beings sort of is most powerful and noticeable is what's happened to the planet's hydrology, to the way that water moves around the Earth. If you want one thing to bear in mind to understand this century, it's going to be that warm air holds more water vapor than cold. The atmosphere is about 4% wetter than it was 40 years ago on average. That is an astonishing change in a basic physical parameter of this Earth, and it loads the dice for drought and for flood, both of which we're seeing in enormous abundance all over the Earth. Just think about the last couple of years. Summer 2010, Russia, biggest heat wave. They had never reached 100 degrees in Moscow before, but it was up there day after day after day. Big fires, but the real point was the Kremlin got spooked and stopped all grain export to the rest of the world because their crop was not good. Russia in a normal year is the third biggest grain exporter on the planet. So of course, instantly the price of corn and wheat and things shoot up, something like 60%, and they've stuck up there since because we've had one crop failure after another. North China Plain, parts of Western Europe, Horn of Africa. We got to watch on this continent that insane drought and heat wave last year in Texas and Oklahoma set records for the warmest summers any American state has ever experienced. We think 500 million trees died in Texas last year. South of the border, that drought continues. Mexico is dry as dust. It is dust in many places. By some estimates, food production has dropped something like 40% across much of Mexico. It's wild, that drought, and it's wilder that at the same moment, okay, we're having incredible flood in other places not far away. But if you think about it, of course, it makes sense. A water vapor molecule, once it's evaporated up into the atmosphere, has a residence time there of about 7 days. It's going to come down, and increasingly it comes down hard. Summer 2010, Russia's baking just a little ways away up on the Khyber Pass, an area that normally gets 3 feet of rain in a year. They got 12 feet of rain in a week. And that's why the Indus River swelled to the point where it covered a quarter of the country and 20 million people were out of their homes for at least a while. Think about that kind of number. That's 2/3 of the population of this state, you know, out of their homes. After that, it was Queensland and Australia. Then this time last year, it was the Mississippi and the Missouri carrying absolutely record volumes of water. We were blowing up levees to save cities. Last August, it was time for my home state, Vermont. Hurricane Irene comes ambling up the east coast of the United States, and it crosses, it's not that big a storm, but it crosses the ocean off New York and New Jersey, which are at record sea surface temperatures, allowing it to just like a sponge soak up water, which it then dumps on Vermont. To understand the kind of change that's going on, to understand why I called that most recent book by this odd name, Earth, EAARTH, you kind of need, I think, to pronounce it correctly, you need to sort of remember your former governor. Sort of Earth would be sort of the correct pronunciation. To understand why I called it that, you need to sort of think about what happened when that rain cloud got up to Vermont. When the rain dropped, I mean, we have 250 years of rainfall records in Vermont. That means, you know, like 10,000 rainstorms. So those of you who have ever taken a statistics course know the odds of breaking that record would be very small, but if you were going to break it, it would be by a millimeter. You know, that's how records get broken. Instead, we broke our old one-day rainfall records by 25 and 30%. The next week, Hurricane Katie comes up the East Coast. It comes a little bit further west inland. Upstate New York, Binghamton broke its old one-day rainfall record by 60%. That's not really statistically possible, except that that rainfall is coming on a different planet than those old records were set on. And, you know, in Vermont, we still have enough money that we can kind of cope, although it's hard. A few weeks later, it's Central America that has the biggest rainfalls that they've ever experienced. And, you know, there are leaders of countries saying things like, we lost 15 years worth of development last night when the roads and bridges went out. After that, in December, it's Thailand. I mean, we're talking about, you know, Bangkok, a huge, important city, cradle of Buddhist civilization, you know, underwater. They think that the Thai GDP contracted 9% in the fourth quarter as it dealt with that flood. Think about that kind of economic hit. When you do, you understand why, among other things, it's not just scientists that are warning us now, sort of flashing red alarms about climate change. It's the part of our economy that we ask to analyze risk for us, the insurance industry, who's saying over and over and over again, there is no other way to explain. I mean, Munich Re, the biggest insurance company in the world, said in its annual report last year, there's no other possible explanation for the spike we see in payouts and things other than the rapid onset of climate change. The only couple of things I want you to just bear in mind at the end of this are, one, we're still at the beginning of this experiment in global warming. We've raised the temperature 1 degree, but the same climatologists who told us that that was going to happen, they're telling us with robust confidence that unless we get off coal and oil and gas far quicker than any government is currently planning to do it, that number will be something like 4 degrees before the century is out, and much of it will be locked in soon, and there is no reason to think that we can cope with that. And the team at Stanford, a couple of years ago, just looked at the question, what happens to grain yields as temperatures rise into that range? Because, of course, corn and wheat and soybeans and things all evolved in the Holocene like we did. In fact, they may be more, since they have roots, you know, they're more, in a sense, at risk. What they found was, from this point, every degree increase in global average temperature should reduce grain yields about 10%. You all know enough about the world to kind of do that math in your head. Think about what it means for development, for public health, for social justice, for war and peace, for rights of women, for all the things we care about around the world, to imagine then a world with 10 or 20% fewer calories than we have now. It means nothing good. It's impossible. It's by far the biggest thing that's ever happened in the course of the human experiment. We can't let it happen. We can't let it happen. We got to figure out how to stop it, and at the moment we are not figuring out how to stop it. Each year the amount of carbon pouring into the atmosphere goes up, and each year the temperature is going up and up and up. So that's the end of the science lesson, okay? And it's the end of the part where I can kind of footnote for you and provide easy statistic. What we got to talk about now is less science than art, and it's about the question of what we're going to do about it and what that's going to look like, and that's going to lead us inevitably into some discussion of politics and of how to deal with this issue. We could talk about engineering for a long time, and that would be fun, because we actually are coming up with lots of the solutions that we need. 20, 25 years ago, in the Earth Day speech, you'd get up and talk about solar power, windmills. We were doing it with our fingers crossed because it wasn't ready yet for prime time, but now it is. We know how to do it. In fact, to give you an example, I was telling people earlier today this story about being in China, doing a story for the National Geographic not long ago, and spending a day with a guy named Huang Ming, who runs Hemin Engineering, the biggest solar thermal company on Earth. So big that 25% of Chinese, when they take a shower at night, their hot water is coming from solar panels on the roof, tubes. It's pretty simple technology, okay? When they've installed 60 million of these arrays across China, not by government edict, but through market forces. And it was really revealing for me. In this country, the percentage of people who get their hot water from the sun is under 1%. And most of that is used for swimming pools, nothing else, okay? It was really revealing to talk with this guy. We had a great long discussion. He's an engineer, very humble guy now, I think, a 100 millionaire of some kind, but he, at some point, he started telling me about his prized possession in his museum. His prized possession is an old, rusting solar thermal panel. He said, that panel was on the roof of the White House. Jimmy Carter put it there in 1979, and Ronald Reagan took it down in 1985 because he wanted, manlier forms of energy or whatever it was, okay? And to me, that was, there's some clicked, tumblers clicked in place in my head. At some deep level, this is far more about politics than it is about technology, Here's the thing. If you want to talk about all the reasons we haven't done the things we should have, and there's a lot of long things we can list about human psychology and inertia and so on and so forth, the biggest, most fundamental problem is that the fossil fuel industry is the richest and most powerful industry on the face of the earth, and so far they've been able to use that power to block and delay action. Delaying and preventing things is the easiest task in political systems, okay? And the few exceptions, are things that we should really take pride in. One is what California's done. It's powerful to see that the new laws about carbon emissions in this country, they're small and a beginning, but they point the way, and they're one of the very few places that point that way. And so far, they're not being followed by people in other places. And the reason why is that immense power of the fossil fuel industry. The way it should work is that and this is what we've tried for 20 years, our scientists have sat down with our political leaders and patiently explained to them what the problem is, that we're facing the biggest problem we've ever faced, that economists can tell us exactly the right way to deal with this, to put a price on carbon that reflects its damage in the atmosphere, that should work. That's how democracy should work. But as that process is happening, in the other ear of our political leaders, the fossil fuel industry is bellowing a toxic mix of threats and promises, and that's been enough to cancel it out so far. And hence, we're going to have to figure out some other currency in which to work. We are never going to match the fossil fuel. Exxon made more money last year than any company in the history of money okay? We're not going to match that. We're going to have to figure out other currencies to work in. Passion and spirit and creativity, the currencies of movements. That's what I've been kind of working on the last few years. I got to tell you that as I talk about this, don't confuse me for an expert, because I'm not. I'm not sure there are really any experts on movement building. But at a certain point, I mean, in fact, I'm the exact opposite of what would be I'm a writer by inclination and training and desire. Writers are, think about it. Left to our own devices, we like to sit in our rooms and type. We're the furthest thing from activists or leaders or whatever. But at a certain point, well, I'll tell you what the point was. I'd been to Bangladesh to do a story. Bangladesh suffering badly already from climate change. The Bay of Bengal is rising and flooding people. The great sacred rivers of Asia, the Ganges and the Brahmaputra, the glaciers up there will eventually dwindle and cause them big trouble. But when I was there, the trouble they were having was acute, not chronic. They were having their first big outbreak of a disease called dengue fever. Mosquito-borne disease sweeping across South America and Asia in the last decade because Aedes aegypti, the mosquito that carries it, really likes the warm, wet world we're built. If you were watching our planet through a telescope and trying to figure out what the hell we were doing to our atmosphere, a reasonable explanation would be that we had embarked on some kind of planet-scale mosquito ranching experiment, and this was our method of getting it done. So there were lots of people dying of dengue when I was in, and people were freaking out. There were big pictures, blown up pictures of the mosquito up on the newspapers and on and on and on and on. And I eventually, I was spending a lot of time in the slums, so I got bit by the wrong mosquito and I got sick, and I was sick as I've been, but I'm strong and healthy going in, so in the end, fine. A lot of people in that part of the world aren't particularly strong or healthy or well-fed going in. And I remember sort of looking at people in the hospital ward, just, lined up in cots, shivering, shaking, some of them dying. And my main reaction was just, damn, this is unfair. When you try to measure how much carbon each country in the world emits, the 140 million people in Bangladesh aren't even a number. They're just a rounding error in the calculations, okay? Most people don't have cars, and they're not on the electric grid, so they're not producing carbon. They're just suffering from it. The 4% of us who live in this country are responsible for something like a quarter of the global warming gases in the atmosphere, because that CO2 lasts up there 100 years, and we've been burning it a long time. And when I got back from that trip, I was like, I should do something. More than just write about this and talk about this, should do something. I didn't know what to do. I'm a writer. I live in the woods in Vermont, the second smallest state in the Union. I had no idea. I called up a couple of my other writer friends in Vermont, Gary's good friend John Elder, some others, and called them up and said, here's what we're going to do. We're going to go up to Burlington, which is our main city, 50,000 people, so not such a main, it was what we got, okay? We're going to go up, and we're going to sit in on the steps of the federal building, and we'll get arrested, and there'll be a little story in the paper, and at least we will have done something. And these other writers is clueless, oh, that sounds like a good plan, let's do that, And happily, one of them called the police in Burlington. So what will happen if we carry out this intrepid stunt, And the police said, nothing will happen. Stay there as long as you want, So we had to recalibrate, and I sent out emails to everybody. I said, we're going to go for a walk. And we left 2 weeks later. We left from Robert Frost's old summer writing cabin up in the Green Mountains, because he's kind of our patron saint. If we'd been in California, we would have left from Gary Snyder's cabin up in the mountains, But we walked for 5 days, and we slept in farm fields along the way. I'm a Methodist Sunday school teacher, so I had called up the sort of Methodist mafia en route to make sure that there would be potluck suppers, the Methodist sacrament would be available as we walked. And by the time we get to Burlington, there's 1,000 people walking. Now, you guys are residents of the biggest state in the Union, and you know, I mean, to you 1,000 people is not so many, but in Vermont, with the possible exception of University of Vermont hockey games, this is as many people as ever assemble for any purpose. And all of our political leaders, you know, came down to meet us down at and they all signed on to this piece of cardboard we've been carrying across the state saying if we elected, we'll work to stop carbon emissions and all this. Even, I mean, not just the Liberal Republic. I mean, I was pretty sure Bernie Sanders would sign on, you know, but also the, you know, the woman who was running for Congress on the Republican ticket and who almost won, she'd said 2 months before in her, when she announced for office, she said, I'm not sure global warming is real, more research needs to be done. Well, the more research that needed to be done, it turned out, was on the topic, how many people will walk across Vermont, and asked me to change my mind, you know, and empirically 1,000 was sufficient. And that was good. That's how it's supposed to work, you know, it was right. The only downer, and this was 5 years ago, I guess, was to open the newspaper the next day and see a story saying that 1,000 people in Vermont might have been the largest demonstration that had yet taken place in the US about global warming. So when we read that, we thought, no wonder we're losing. We have the superstructure of a movement. We've got, you know, we've got Al Gore, we've got scientists, we've got economists, we've got engineers, we've got policy wonks, we've got all the things you would need for a movement. The only part we forgot was the movement part. There's nothing there, okay? And can we build that outside of, you know, outside of the confines of funky Vermont? And so we decided to try. Now, when I say we, you know, this sounds like it would be some great organization or something. It was much more absurd than that. It was myself and 7 seniors at Middlebury College where I hang out. So they, you know, they were seniors, so they weren't done with school, but they were more or less done with school and ready to go. And our first task, we thought, was to figure out how to organize globally. And the trouble, of course, with organizing globally is everybody insists on speaking their own language. So what are you going to do? And so we were both thrilled and horrified when December 2007 or January 2008, our most important climatologist, Jim Hansen at NASA, publishes a paper that says we now know enough about carbon to know how much is too much. Any value for carbon in the atmosphere greater than 350 parts per million is not compatible with the planet on which civilization developed and to which life on Earth is adapted, okay, which is very strong language for scientists to use, and it is way stronger still when you know that wherever you are tonight, you know, in California or in China, the atmosphere is 393 parts per million CO2 and growing about 2 parts per million per year, which is why Texas burns and Pakistan drowns. And it's why we're not going to actually stop global warming. At best, we're going to keep it from getting worse than it has to, okay? And so that was a kick in the teeth to read, but on the other hand, we thought, maybe there's something to work with here as organizers, because though you wouldn't normally choose a wonky scientific data point around which to organize, the virtue of Arabic numerals is they cross linguistic boundaries. And so the 350 will mean exactly the same thing here and everywhere. And so we decided to go to work. Now, you know, this was a ludicrous proposition, but there were 7 young people, and there are 7 continents, so each one took one. The one that took the Antarctic also had to take the internet, you know, because it's kind of its own continent. And off we set. And our goal was to find other people like ourselves around the world. And that's what we, you know, set out to do. We did these training camps for young people, one in Turkey for Central Asia, I remember one in the Caribbean, one in Johannesburg, about a couple of kids from each country, in Africa down. Most had never been on an airplane or anything, but they were great organizers, and they fanned out back around the world, and we told everybody we're going to try to do this first big day in the fall of 2009 to kind of bring attention to this number, to drive it into the information bloodstream of the planet. And we had no idea how it'd come out, because we had no money or anything. But 2 days before we got the sense it might work, October 22nd, I guess, we were sitting around this little borrowed office in Midtown Manhattan, 1 room, 1 table, the 8 of us around it with our laptops open, you know, typing out press releases. And we get a phone call a bad satellite connection from Addis Ababa in Ethiopia. And our organizer there, you know, the volunteer who was in charge of Ethiopia for us, is a 17-year-old girl named Lily. And she said, you know, the government took away our permit for Saturday, so we're going to, Ethiopia, not a particularly always nice government, they took away our permit. We're doing it today before they can stop us. We're so sorry. We don't mean to jump the gun. We don't want to spoil it for everybody. We'd so look forward to doing it at the same time as everybody else. And we have 15,000 kids out in the street right now chanting 350. So, you know, I was like, Lily, it's okay about the date, you know. And it was an auspicious beginning. I mean, the next picture that came in 2 hours later was from a bunch of US troops in Afghanistan who we had no idea even had heard about this. They made a big 350 out of sandbags and took a picture of it and sent us a big note saying we're parking our Humvee for the weekend and walking, you know. And after that, for the next 48 hours, it was just incredible. Before it was over, there had been 5,100 demonstrations in 181 countries. CNN called it the most widespread day of political activity in the planet's history. Okay? And what was so interesting about it, well, a lot of things that were beautiful, and I hope you go look at the pictures because they're really something. We have many pictures and they're gorgeous, but one of the things that really struck us and over and over and over again was, you know, I'd spent all my life hearing that environmentalism was something that rich white people did, and if you had to worry where your next meal was coming from, you wouldn't be an environmentalist, and on and on and on. It turned out it was immediately apparent that most of the people that we were working with around the world were poor and black and brown and Asian and young, because that's what most of the world is composed of, you know. And they were every bit as interested as anybody else in what the future would hold. Maybe more so, because the future, if you're in Bangladesh or Pakistan, the future is bearing down on you very hard, you know. It was beautiful to see, beautiful. And it actually was kind of almost, I mean, 6 weeks later, there's a big climate conference in Copenhagen that some of you may still recall. That was supposed to be the place where this kind of movie would come out right, you know, the great finale where the countries of the world would get together and do the right thing and whatever. Well, we convinced, when we got to Copenhagen with all this momentum, we convinced 117 nations to sign on to this 350 target, that was pretty good. The trouble is, of course, that they were the wrong 117 nations. They were all the poor ones. And the addicts, led by us, weren't yet willing to come to terms with that addiction, and so nothing happened, and the thing ended in a complete fizzle, and everybody went home. And I gotta say, I was deeply depressed and discouraged and angry on that final day, and I was glad, therefore, we brought the largest delegation with us to Copenhagen, 350 young people from all over the world, mostly the developing world, mostly countries where, you know, you don't have the possibility of growing up with too many illusions. And these kids kept coming up to me on that last day. They were all really nice, but they just kept saying pretty much the same thing. You know, we didn't expect that we were going to win this right away, because we're up against the hardest power in the world, and it's going to take a little while, so we're going back and going to work. And that's what people did. Even after, you know, 6 months later, the US Senate, then with 60 Democrats, refused to even take a vote on the most moderate, tepid, mild climate change legislation you could imagine, you know. People kept organizing. We've had 2 big days of action, even bigger since then. Now, as Gary said, every country except North Korea is involved. It's beautiful. We'll have another important day in a few weeks that I hope you guys will help with. It's on the 5th of May, and it's a day that we're calling Connect the Dots, and it'll be people all over the world who've already felt some of the sting of climate change. They've dealt with forest fire or drought or flood or insect infestation or crop failure, or some places where people are doing things that really help, you know, where they're putting up community gardens and windmills and things like that. And what we're going to say in each one of these is we need the rest of people to understand this pattern, to connect these dots, to no longer think of these tragedies as one-off things that we kind of watch for a night on the news and then move on, or maybe send $50 to the Red Cross to help people with, but to understand that they fit together, to connect those dots, to figure out that the biggest thing that ever happened in the world is happening. Now, you know, some of it will be a little lighthearted, I hope. I was talking to our climbing team today, they're going up into some big glacier up in one of the melting glaciers someplace up in California. And they're going to take a big banner with them, and the question was what should be on the banner, and you know, some dire message about global warming. And my suggestion, which I believe has been adopted, is that instead we should just quote from that great classic of our literature, The Wizard of Oz. It should just say, you know, I'm melting on the, you know, on the banner. But other places, it'll be, I'm afraid, a little edgier. I mean, I think people in Pakistan now who have dealt with 2 straight years of being forced from their homes by floods are in the, you know, they're no longer. The biggest thing that happened in Pakistan the last couple of years was not Osama bin Laden getting shot, though to us it was, but to everybody else there, they had to keep getting up and leaving their homes and watching them wash away, you know. We need to think about all that. Hopefully this will help. In fact, we know it's helping because the new polling data, even in the last few weeks, shows an increasing number of Americans concerned about climate change, and the reason is they're connecting it with the extreme, even freakish weather that we're seeing over and over and over again. But just this kind of consciousness raising by itself will not be enough. It's become clear to us that we're going to also have to be a little more realist, or maybe a little more aggressive in going after the source of the problem, the political power of that fossil fuel industry that quashes the change that we need. The last year's been instructive, and I'll just tell you the tiny story about this fight against the pipeline down from Canada, the Keystone pipeline from the tar sands of northern Canada. Now, we probably should have gotten involved in fighting this a long time ago, because the thing is just a horror just on its face. The indigenous people up there have been telling us for a long time, this thing stinks. They've only gotten 3% of the oil out, but they've already moved more earth than the Suez Canal and the Great Wall of China and the 10 biggest dams on earth. If you don't believe me, go look at Google Earth. I mean, it is one big scar on the face of our home planet, you know. But there's a lot of bad things going on at any given moment, so we just didn't focus on this until this time last year when Jim Hansen, again at NASA, said, turns out that those tar sands are the second biggest pool of carbon on Earth after the oil fields of Saudi Arabia. Now, it was burning the oil fields of Saudi Arabia more than any other single thing that raised our temperature a degree. So if we find the next Saudi Arabia, knowing what we now know about climate change, and do the same damn thing, then we're not behaving wisely. And in fact, what Hansen said, again, more outspoken than scientists usually are, he said, if you add the tar sands on top of all the other things we're already burning, all the coal and gas and oil, then it's essentially game over for the climate, quote unquote. So we thought we should try anyway and do something about it, though it seemed the odds were slim. And we wrote a letter. I wrote a letter, and we sent it out with the signatures of some of my friends and some of these indigenous leaders and things, and asking people to come to Washington to engage in civil disobedience. We didn't know what to expect because there hasn't been a lot of big, this was before Occupy, and there hadn't been a lot of big civil disobedience in a long time. The first day of this 2-week thing, 80 of us were there, and that was more than we'd expected, and it was more than the police expected. And normally the police in Washington, who deal with 2 or 3 people at a time doing this kind of thing, just haul them away in handcuffs and then release them after a couple hours, and they pay a $100 fine, and it's pretty well set practice. But the police said, you know what, we really don't want to deal with 2 weeks of this. We're going to try and deter you guys. So the first group of us got to go and spend 3 days in what's called Central Cell Block in DC, which is, you know, about as much fun as it sounds like it would be. But the good news was that it didn't deter anyone. In fact, as is often the case, the kind of police logic that works reasonably well with criminals works less well with idealists. And the next day there were 100 people there, and the next day 120. And by the time the 2 weeks were over, 1,253 people had been arrested, the biggest civil disobedience action in 30 years. And this pipeline thing was on the agenda. And then we followed the president around the country for the next few months. And I'm sure some of you helped. And it was very polite. Every place he went, you know, he was greeted by big groups of students. And they were all chanting. They weren't chanting, you know, attacks on him. They were chanting, yes, we can stop the pipeline, you know. And then we went back to Washington in early November, and we said we're going to circle the White House. We didn't know if we could do it. No one had really ever tried it before. We were trying on Google Earth to count how many people it would take. We didn't really know, but it turned out it didn't matter because enough people showed up that we were shoulder to shoulder, 5 deep around the mile-long perimeter of the White House. And it was a beautiful day, in part because it was all, again, positive. Every single sign that anyone was carrying was a quote from Barack Obama in 2008. Time to end the tyranny of oil, you know. In my administration, the rise of the oceans will begin to slow and the planet will begin to heal. And we were saying, you know, most of the time when you've tried to do these things, you've been stymied by Congress, but here's your chance. You can block this pipeline. And 4 days later, the president said, okay, we're going to delay this thing for a year at least, which was an unlikely victory. 3 weeks before, National Journal, the Insider magazine in Washington had polled its 300 energy experts up on the Hill and lobbyists and things, and 97% of them said that this thing would get its permit last year. So it was a small victory when we won, you know, and a temporary victory, of course. All environmental victories are temporary. And this one may be more temporary than most because big oil it never loses, and it did not like losing, and it has struck back with a real vengeance, and it's run tens of millions of dollars of ads filled with complete falsehoods about this pipeline and how it's going to create 1 billion jobs and on and on and on. All nonsense, all untrue, but effective, you know. We held this victory in the Senate by 2 votes in February. And the Republicans announced today that they're bringing it up again and going to force another vote. We may lose. Even if we win, okay? Even if we win, it's not like we've stopped global warming. This is one project among 1,000. There's not, you know, it's like the little Dutch boy, but with, you know, 650 leaks and not very many fingers. I mean, it's just, you can't do it that way, really. What was important about this last year was that we got a sense of what we would need to do and how we could do it, of the kind of movement we could build and the kind of tactics we would need and the kind of commitment and sacrifice it would take. This is every bit as important for our time as the civil rights movement was in its time, and it's going to require the same kind of commitment and work. And unlike the civil rights movement, there's no promise that we're going to win in the end. You know, Martin Luther King always ended almost every speech. He'd quote from the abolitionist Theodore Parker. He'd say, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. It's going to take a while, but we're going to get there. Okay? The arc of the physical universe is short, and it bends toward heat. And if we don't win soon, we won't win. You know, there's a very, chemistry and physics impose a time limit. So I got no promises that we're going to win. I don't know. There were a couple of things I was saying earlier today about that civil disobedience that seemed important to me as sort of lessons for the future. And I want to just tell them quickly. One is, when we sent out the letter, we said, you know what? Young people should not have to be the cannon fodder here. If you're graduating from college right now, really an arrest record in our economy is not really what you want on your resume, most of all, you know. On the other hand, one of the privileges of growing older is, past a certain point, what the hell are they going to do to you? You know? And so it was really, really good to see what happened in D.C. We didn't ask people, how old are you? I'm from the country, that would be rude, you know. But we did say to them, who was president when you were born? Okay? And the two biggest cohorts of arrestees came from the FDR and the Truman administrations, okay? On the last day, there was an 86-year-old guy arrested with a sign around his neck that said, World War II vet, handle with care. He'd been born in the Harding administration, okay? So that was good. It was really good, I can tell you this, for the young people who've led this movement from the beginning, to see their elders stepping up and showing some accountability for lives spent, among other things, pouring carbon into the atmosphere. And it was really, really good to see that happening. The other thing we told people that I think is important is, if you want to come get arrested, we need you in your Sunday best. Show up in a necktie or dress, okay? People did. And it's not because, I mean, I'm from Vermont, which I'm sensing is sort of sartorially kind of like here, you know? We don't really do a lot of neckties in Vermont. But we wanted a way to demonstrate the important thing, which is that we are not in any way militants or extremists in this fight. All we're asking for is a planet that works a little bit like the one on which we were born, okay? Militants and extremists work for oil companies. If you get up in the morning and you're willing to enrich yourself with the project of altering the chemical composition of the atmosphere, then you are an extremist. You are behaving in a fashion more radical than any human being before you has behaved. We've never tried anything like that. It's, you know, if you were writing the next Bond movie and you had the villain say, you know, give me $1 trillion or I will alter the chemical composition of the atmosphere, you'd say, that's a little much, you know. Maybe we just should have nuclear weapons or something, you know. I mean, it's unbelievable the scale on which the most powerful people in our world are now acting, and we have to be willing to say that. As I said before, no guarantees that we will win this fight. The only guarantee I can give you, because I've spent much of the last 4 years in kind of constant motion around the planet, spewing carbon behind me, the only guarantee I can give you is that there is a movement building all over the world. Many of the places where people have done nothing to cause this problem, and yet they're willing to work in solidarity with those of us who have. All over the world tonight, and most nights, there are people in rooms like this one. I mean, right now, figuring out what they're going to do for May 5th and this big day of connect the dots and things, but those rooms are there and those people are there. And it's always a great honor to be in those rooms, and it is such an honor to get to be in this one tonight and to get to say such thanks to you for what you've done so far, and even more thanks for what you will do in the future. I do not know how it will come out. I do know that we'll stand side by side and do what we can and see how it comes out. Thank you all very much. Thank you all. That's too kind. Thank you all.
Still want to do some questions?
Absolutely. I went on a little long, didn't I?
No, that's fine. That's fine. We're going to take a few minutes now to open it up for questions from the audience. And so those of you who can stay a little longer, please do. We'll try to hear whatever you ask, so speak loudly and clearly, or maybe we can get a mobile microphone to wherever you are, but we'll see what we can do for a few minutes. Thank you. So anybody with a question? Yeah.
Bill, could you speak to corporate personhood?
Sure.
I feel like that's at the root of a lot of these problems.
Sure, that's a good question about corporate personhood, because it's one of the things that this sort of broader movement, of which the environmental movement is a part of, is trying to kind of deal with. And here's the thing I'd say. I'm no expert on politics, and I feel particularly sheepish about talking about politics in the presence of a great politician and a great leader in the front row. It's really good to see you, Governor Brown. But here's what I think about the corporate personhood thing, and why I think it's really important to overturn Citizens United and all of that. My take is only partly kind of practical. Okay, it's one of the things that it gives, you know, these guys so much power and whatever else, but at some other level it may be almost more a kind of writerly thing. It just seems to me that it's a wrong idea. Okay, it's not that corporations are evil. They're not necessarily. It's that they're simple. Okay, human beings, real persons, we're extraordinarily complicated. We have a lot of, you know, very base urges and instincts and drives that cause us to do things sometimes that we're not proud of and be grasping and whatever else. But there are other things going on. There's art, which is always complicated, and religion, these kind of, you know, causes us to do, you know, and there's sex, and you know, all the things that make us the very complicated beings that we are, and that sometimes lead us to act against what might be our kind of crudest self-interest, and to figure out how to do remarkable things. And the reason that corporations aren't persons is because they have none of that, okay? If they're organisms, they're kind of, you know, single-celled organisms, and you put them on a petri dish and they wriggle right to the sugar, you know, and that's fine for what they're supposed to do. That's why they do it well, you know? If your job is, you know, if what you're trying to do is build a car, then you don't want a church or an art museum or whatever to do it. You want people who's, you know, very fixated on doing this one thing and doing it right. But if you want to figure out what, you know, how many miles per gallon a car should get, or whether it'd be better to have a bus than a train than a car or something like that, then they can't add anything to that conversation, because they're not persons. They're not complicated in that way. And so it just seems to me not only a legal and practical and everything else mistake, but just at the basic, you know, most basic level, just a kind of mistaken idea that we fell into, and that we best fall out of soon, you know, before any more of that damage from that oversimplicity is done.
Thank you for being here. I have a sensitive question about the population growth. I'm wondering if I could hear a comment about that.
Sure. I wrote a book about population some years ago called Maybe One, an argument for smaller families. And indeed I have one absolutely beautiful daughter who it's hard to be away from. Population is one part of the equation that causes our problem. It's, at the moment, the one part of the equation that we've really done anything significant about. You know, beginning in this country with, you know, the kind of alarm 30 or 40 years ago over the population bomb or the population explosion, whatever you want to say, people went to work. First a little bit here, but mostly then in the developing world. And they figured out what you needed to do. And what you needed to do was educate women and empower them to some degree. And when you did, birth rates fell, not just by a little, okay? 30 years ago, the average woman on this earth had 6 children. That number is now about 2.4 and continuing to fall. Even if you factor out China with its mandatory policies, okay? That So that's a kind of good news, bad news thing. There's 7 billion of us on this earth. Because there's sort of demographic momentum, there's still people coming into their childbearing years in large numbers, the number will continue to grow, barring disaster for a little while. Demographers think it top out about 9 billion in the middle of the century and then decline. So, we have trouble with 7 billion. 9 billion will be, yes, harder. But there's not, at the moment, an incredible amount we can do to change that number very much, okay? The real difficulty, the biggest numerical part of the problem now, is the great surge in consumption around the world. So the biggest increases in carbon emissions are coming from, say, China, where population is essentially flat, but where people are beginning to consume like Americans, okay? And we need to remember sometimes just how great the gulf between the big consumers and the small consumers are. So most population growth coming in sub-Saharan Africa. But Gary and I were talking about this earlier today, and I remembered this statistic that I saw somewhere recently. The average American uses more energy between the stroke of midnight on New Year's Eve and dinner on January 2nd than the average Tanzanian uses in the course of a year. Okay, so for global warming purposes, the number of Tanzanians is not a significant variable, We got to figure out how we break the momentum of the consumption curve in sort of the same way that we broke some of the momentum of that fertility curve. We think that the best analogy to kind of educating women, in this case, will be putting a price on carbon that reflects the damage it does in the atmosphere so that every day and every decision we make, we're reminded of what that is. And if we ever get that, we'll see if it works as well. That's, at some level, what the whole fight is about. That's a very good question. Thank you.
Way over there.
Several dozen communities in Pennsylvania, New England, and the country of Ecuador, as well as Brazil, have passed rights of nature ordinances, and would love to hear your perspective on rights of nature and where we go with it.
Yeah, I think some of this started in Bolivia, maybe, and it's a very good thing to be enunciating and working on. And like most things, what it really is a part of a sort of movement building strategy, i.e. it's part of the way we educate ourselves about where we need to go. These rights of nature petitions or the Earth Charter, or they're not going to be the legal documents that get us out of the problem we're in. In fact, it won't be, at least at first, a legal document that gets us out of the problem we're in. It'll be building enough power as a movement that we can begin to counter the power of the fossil fuel industry, to the point where political decision makers will be worried as much about our power as they are attracted or scared by the money that the Exxons of the world can bring to bear, okay? And so things like that are a wonderful part of doing this. And it's going to take all kinds of people. One of the things about this movement building we're trying to do is it can't be just confined to people who think of themselves as already as sort of die-hard environmentalists and things. It's going to have to be big and broad, and it's fun to watch that happen. For me, one of the best parts of the last few years has been doing lots and lots of organizing in religious communities around the world, bringing that kind of spiritual power to bear on these issues. And increasingly, it's happening all over the place. Young evangelicals in this country are, by large margins, eager to do things about this. In the rest of the world, everybody from the Dalai Lama to, I was telling folks earlier today, one of the high points of that first year of organizing, when we were trying to have that day of action, we couldn't, we had no money, but we did, the Dalai Lama came on board right away, but then so did Bartholomew, patriarch of the Orthodox Church, leader of 400 million Eastern Christians. And he gave a sermon a couple of weeks before that day of action in which he said, plain-spoken cleric that he said, global warming is a sin and 350 is an act of redemption, period, okay? So that helped our organizing efforts across the Balkans, you know. It's like, good, this is good. I'll always remember, and to me this was really good, important, going to Bethlehem to do some organizing. And Bethlehem's not even an easy place to get to anymore. But the Dead Sea is shrinking very rapidly as temperatures rise. So people wanted to do some big thing for that day, but there's too many military barriers in the way to do something, you know, together. So the Jordanians said, we're making a giant human 3 on our beach, you know. And the Palestinians said, we'll do the 5 in Palestine, in big, huge group of people. And the Israelis said, okay, we'll do the 0 where we are. And it was, the picture of that was one of the most moving pictures I ever seen, because it was like people saying, okay, we can put aside some of what divides us to get to work on the things that we have to work on together. And it was a good lesson, and we need to do it.
Way in the back, the lady in white.
I would like to know, thank you. I would like to know what this community is going to do on May 5th.
Well, I would too. And I assume, let me say one thing first, which is I'm a poor organizer, okay? I'm a writer, so I want you all to go home and sign up for 350.org, okay? All you have to do is go to the website and just put in your email address so we can keep you. We won't come asking, one time a year I send out a pathetic little, at Christmas time, pathetic little thing asking for money, but I can never really do it, so it always just says, you know, if you do, you know, we'd rather have you take action than give money, so don't really bother. And a surprisingly large number of people give money anyway, it's weird, but we won't be bothering that, but we'll just keep you up to date every once in a while on what we're doing, including as things come toward May 5th. But I bet that people in the community here will be organizing something over the next little while to be happening on May 5th. I sure hope so. It'll be, you know, for me, one of the pleasures, you know, of these days is sitting at the computer as images stream in, watching them come in and just say, oh, I remember being there, and, you know, I remember those people, and it'll be good. Maybe you want to be a person who'll be the sort of point person for figuring things out.
At 95, it's not so easy. But
so that's the Wilson administration? Yeah.
1916.
Yeah,
what does
there
that
you go.
make?
I think that's Woodrow Wilson. That's pretty astonishing.
Good old Woodrow Wilson.
There you go.
But what I feel is, well, you said people dress up and look nice, and that's what we did as Freedom Riders in Jackson, Mississippi. But and it helped because the policeman who arrested us asked me if I would come in and talk to him. He talked with me for about 45 minutes. He wanted to know what was going on in Berkeley, what was going on in the North. And because I had gone with my white hat and my veil and my white gloves, he didn't quite know what to do with me. And we had 4 children. So it's worth it to look good.
Ma'am, I just want to say it was worth it for me to make this trip, if for no other reason than to get to hear that story and see your face. So thank you very much.
What advice do you have for people who'd like to take up the fight?
Well, it sounds like you got it together over there with her, you know. You got to jump in. So you guys are going to organize something for the 5th of May, okay? And it doesn't need to be something enormous. It just needs to be something pretty and interesting and focused around something that's happening here, good or bad. And you need in the middle of it a big black cardboard dot, you know, so you can hold it up and everybody can see it and we can say connect these dots. Now, after May 5th, there's lots of other things to do, you know, and some of them are things that you need to do locally in your community to make it greener and better and all of that. And those things are really important. And this is one of these places where clearly that's happening, and I hope that you work on those things. Just don't make the mistake of only working on those things, because change on the scale that we're having can't be solved in one community or in even one state, okay? Important as those things are. I mean, I was telling people earlier today, we really learned this lesson in Vermont in the fall, okay? Vermont's like, you know, we have this great local food network in Vermont. We were just like you guys. We're really involved in all this. We love it. We've been working hard on it, one of the leaders in the world, and it's really fun. And when those huge flooding rains came, one of the things that got flooded away was many of the best small farms around the state just washed away, and now those fields are covered with sand and nothing got harvested last year and everybody's out of money, and it's horrible to watch. And it just reminded me so much that we got to work in our places, but we also got to save some energy for working on the large, because you can have the best, you know, organic farm that there ever was, and if it doesn't rain for 30 days or if it rains every day for 30 days, then you're not growing anything. You're out of luck. And we've got to do both these things at once. So you'll figure out tons of stuff to do, and it's people your age, you know, around the world who are leading this fight. That 17-year-old girl in Ethiopia was no exception, you know. These are who many of our best organizers and things around are. So join on in at 350.org and we'll give you plenty of work to do, okay?
Okay.
Thank you, man.
This will be our last question now.
You choose, Gary.
Bill, since you come from Vermont, I'm sure you're aware of public banking, and I'm just wondering if you agree with me to what extent. I think that abolishing corporate personhood and having as many public banks as we can is two of the greatest strategies for undermining the power of corporate power.
I think it's a good idea. Let me say, you know, one way to think about this, one of the lessons we should have learned from the last few years when this new phrase entered our vocabulary, the phrase too big to fail, okay? One of the things we should have learned from that was not just that, I mean, if something's, the lesson that Washington learned was if something's too big to fail, let's give it several trillion of our dollars so it doesn't, okay? Maybe we had to do that, maybe we didn't, I don't know. But the real lesson is if something's too big to fail, it's too big, okay? And you got to make it smaller. That's, you know, and it's not just banks, though that's an important one. Our energy system and our agricultural system are just as oversized and brittle and vulnerable as our banking system was. And it's why it's good news that we've begun the process of making them a little smaller. If you want a happy statistic after all the sad ones I told you, here it is. Last year, the USDA said there were more farms in America instead of fewer for the first time in 150 years, okay? That's good. And that's the promise of the world that we're working towards, a place where communities get much stronger and corporate power gets much weaker, okay? And it's the world that we want, world that we need. When I wrote this book, Deep Economy, one of the things that really motivated me was the polling data that showed that Americans, when you ask them how happy they are with their lives, the percentage who say, I'm very happy, peaked in 1956 and has gone downhill since. Now, I wasn't quite around in 1956, so I don't know what was going on, but I do know what's happened since, which is that we spent most of our wealth since the end of the Second World War on the project of building bigger houses farther apart from each other, okay? And as a result, not only did we have huge environmental consequences and clogged roads and whatever, we also, on average, because we run into each other less often, have literally half as many close friends per capita. If you'd been sitting there 50 years ago, you would have had twice as many people with whom you were close. There's not enough iPods on Earth to make up for that loss, you know? And that's why it's really good to, you want to know what's good about a farmer's market? It's not just that it's ecologically better. It's not just that it's culinarily better, though it is. I mean, you know, I traveled 1,000 miles this week. That's how the tomato feels when it travels too, you know? I mean, it's not good. But the real reason the farmer's market's better is because sociologists followed some shoppers, first around supermarket, then around the farmer's market. You've been to the supermarket, so you know how it works. You walk in, you fall into a light fluorescent trance. You visit the Stations of the Cross around the supermarket. That's it. When they followed shoppers around the farmer's market, they were having 10 times as many conversations per visit. They were beginning to do the work of re-knitting communities back together, okay? This is the world towards which we're moving, and it is a world of great promise. And the only thing that can really keep it from happening is the incredible friction that will come as we change the physical operation of the planet. And we got to stop as quickly as we can that out-of-control climate change. We've got to build that movement. We've got to make it strong, in part so not just that we can safeguard what we have now, but so that we can build a future that is better and more interesting and richer in ways that matter than what we have now. And that's a good, it's not just that we got to be against things, we got to be for things too. And those are the things we got to be for, and it's all part of something. And I don't know if we can do it, but I know that, you know, if the spirit in a room like this is harnessable, then we can do it. At least we'll try. Thank you all.